Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the winter of 1852, a portrait of a young man was discovered in the attic of the Sorrel Weed House, one of Savannah's most prominent historical mansions. The portrait depicted a smiling young man, seemingly content, dressed in formal attire, not typical for someone of his apparent station. What caught the attention of the local historical society wasn't the quality of the painting, which was exceptional, but rather the small inscription at the bottom right corner: Elijah Brown, property of the Winston estate. This single line would eventually unravel a case that the citizens of Savannah would spend over a century trying to forget. The portrait itself was unremarkable at first glance. Oil on canvas, approximately 20 inches by 16 inches, showing a young black man with an unusually composed smile. His eyes, however, seemed to follow viewers around the room, a common trick used by skilled portrait artists of the period. What made this particular painting strange was that slaves were rarely depicted in formal portraiture during the antebellum period, especially not with the dignity afforded to this subject. According to records from the Savannah Historical Society, the painting was initially catalogued simply as Portrait of Unknown Young Man, and placed in storage along with dozens of other recovered artifacts from the city's pre-Civil War era. It wasn't until 1873, over 20 years after its discovery, that anyone took particular interest in the painting. A researcher named Thomas Hardwick, working on a comprehensive documentation of Savannah's architectural history, noticed the portrait while photographing items for the Historical Society's archives. According to his journal entries, discovered in 1965 during a renovation of the Georgia Historical Society building, Hardwick wrote, "The young man's eyes possess a peculiar quality, not quite sadness, not quite acceptance, something else entirely. As though he knows something the viewer does not." Hardwick's curiosity led him to the Winston estate, which by that time had changed hands multiple times and was owned by the Carmichael family. The estate, located approximately 7 miles outside Savannah's historic district, was by then falling into disrepair. The original Winston family had lost most of their fortune during the Civil War, and subsequent owners had lacked the funds to maintain the once impressive property. According to county records from 1873, Hardwick was granted permission to search the estate's remaining documents, most of which were stored in a small outbuilding that had once served as an overseer's residence. Among tax records, ledgers, and various business correspondence, Hardwick discovered a small leather-bound book, approximately 5 inches by 7 inches, with no title on its cover. Inside were detailed records of the Winston plantation slaves, listing names, ages, parentage when known, and most disturbingly, market values. On page 37 of this ledger, Hardwick found the entry for Elijah Brown. Male, age 23, born on property to Martha, deceased. Educated as experiment. Exceptional aptitude for numbers and letters. Potential value as clerk or house servant, $800. The notation educated as experiment caught Hardwick's attention. Such education was unusual and often illegal in many southern states before the Civil War. Another entry, dated October 12, 1851, noted, "EB continues to surpass expectations, has begun maintaining secondary ledgers with minimal supervision, demonstrates remarkable recall of business transactions. Experiment appears successful." This was followed by a more troubling entry from December 3rd of the same year. Concerns regarding EB's growing awareness of his circumstances, began asking questions about his mother's circumstances and fate. Winston suggests tempering education with reminder of station. Hardwick's research into Elijah Brown might have ended there had he not encountered an elderly woman named Sarah Jenkins during his third visit to the former Winston estate. According to Hardwick's journal, Jenkins had been a house servant at the estate as a young girl and remembered Elijah Brown. Her account, as recorded by Hardwick, provides the first substantial description of the man beyond the portrait and ledger entries. Mr. Elijah wasn't like the others, Jenkins told Hardwick. Master Winston had him brought into the house when he was just 7 years old after his mama passed. Said he had a look in his eyes, a kind of knowing. Taught him his letters and numbers himself, which wasn't done in those days. By the time Mr. Elijah was 15, he was keeping all the books for the estate. Master Winston would show him off to visitors sometimes, like he was a trained animal doing tricks. Mr. Elijah would smile and demonstrate his abilities with numbers, calculating sums faster than educated men could with paper and pencil. But when the visitors left, that smile would go away. His eyes turned different then. Jenkins went on to describe how Winston had commissioned the portrait in early 1852, insisting that Elijah maintain his company smile throughout the sittings. Master made him practice that smile for weeks before the painter came, Jenkins recalled. Said he wanted to show his associates what could be accomplished with proper training. The painter came from Charleston, stayed 3 days. Mr. Elijah smiled the whole time, never broke once, but at night I'd hear him in the small room off the kitchen where he slept, talking to himself in whispers, writing things I couldn't understand. According to the estate's records, the portrait was completed in April 1852. Hardwick's research indicated that Winston displayed the painting prominently in his study, often using it to initiate debates with visitors about the intellectual capabilities of slaves, a controversial topic even among slave owners. What happened in the months following the portrait's completion, however, would transform a curious historical footnote into something far more disturbing. County records show that in August 1852, Winston reported Elijah as having escaped. A reward notice appeared in the Savannah Republican newspaper on August 17th. Runaway, educated Negro man, answers to Elijah, age 24, can read and write with proficiency, may attempt to pass correspondence as written by a white man. $100 reward for return to Winston Estate. The notice ran for 3 consecutive weeks, then disappeared from the paper's pages. No further mentions of Elijah's escape or capture appear in public records. Hardwick might have concluded that Elijah had successfully escaped north had he not discovered a series of unusual entries in Winston's personal diary, which had been stored separately from the plantation records. The diary, bound in faded red leather, with the years 1852 through 1854 embossed on the spine, contained increasingly erratic entries beginning in late August 1852, just days after the first runaway notice appeared in the newspaper. The entry dated August 20th reads, "E. did not escape as reported. Necessity required fabrication following discovery of his private writings. Contents too disturbing to detail here. Have secured him in the old storage cellar while determining appropriate course of action. Sarah instructed to inform all that he has run off north." A subsequent entry dated August 25th provides a more troubling glimpse into the situation. E.'s confinement continues. He shows no remorse, maintains that his calculations were correct. The ledgers he kept in secret suggest systematic discrepancies going back 3 years. Funds diverted, transactions recorded incorrectly. The extent of his deception is yet unknown. More concerning are his writings about the others. He has been watching us as we watched him, recording observations, weaknesses. When questioned, he simply smiles, the same smile as in the portrait. It unsettles me greatly. The diary entries become increasingly preoccupied with Elijah in the weeks that follow. Winston describes sleepless nights, hearing what he believed were whispers coming from the sealed cellar. On September 10th, he wrote, "Sarah and 2 others claim they've seen E in the main house at night, despite the cellar door remaining securely locked. Impossible, of course. Yet the ledgers in my study show new entries in his distinctive hand. A trick of the mind, surely, have increased the guard at night regardless. The final mention of Elijah in the diary comes on October 3rd. The matter with E has been resolved permanently. Cellar sealed, portrait to be removed from study and destroyed. Sarah dismissed for spreading rumors among the others. Must focus now on reviewing all accounts and business dealings of the past 3 years to assess the damage done." Hardwick's research indicates that Winston's financial situation deteriorated rapidly in the months following this entry. By early 1853, he had sold several parcels of land and a number of slaves. Correspondence with his bankers in Savannah suggests mounting debts and discrepancies in his accounts that he struggled to explain. A letter from the Bank of Savannah dated February 1853 states, "The inconsistencies in your recent submissions cannot be attributed to simple accounting errors. The pattern suggests deliberate misrepresentation spanning multiple quarters. The bank must insist on immediate clarification and full repayment of all outstanding sums." Winston's response to this letter has been lost to time, but records show that by June 1853 he had sold his remaining property in Savannah and relocated to a much smaller estate near Augusta, Georgia. The once prominent Winston family effectively vanished from Savannah society. The portrait of Elijah, which Winston had supposedly intended to destroy, somehow made its way to the Sorrel Weed house, where it was discovered during renovations nearly a year later. Hardwick's investigation might have ended there had he not decided to examine the former Winston estate one final time before concluding his research. In his journal entry dated July 7, 1873, he wrote, "Return to the Winston property today to clarify several points regarding the architectural modifications made during the 1840s. The current caretaker, a Mr. Reynolds, permitted me to examine the lower levels of the main house, which have remained largely untouched since the Winston family's departure. Among the various storage rooms and wine cellars is a curious space, a small room, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with no windows and a door that appears to have been sealed and then reopened at some point. The walls are unusually thick, and the room sits apart from the other basement chambers. When I inquired about its purpose, Reynolds seemed uncertain, suggesting it might have been a secure storage area for valuables." Hardwick goes on to describe his examination of this room. "The space is empty now, save for a small desk against one wall. The desk appears significantly older than the other furnishings I've observed in the house. Upon closer inspection, I discovered that the inside of the drawer contains writings carved directly into the wood with what must have been a sharp, narrow implement. The text is tiny, precise, and covers every available surface inside the drawer. Much of it appears to be columns of numbers, similar to accounting entries, but without any contextual labels to indicate what is being counted or calculated. Interspersed among these figures are passages of text, written in an educated hand that suggests the writer was well versed in the conventions of written English." According to Hardwick's journal, he copied several of these passages into his notebook. The largest legible section read, "They believe the portrait captures merely my face. The artist was skilled, but unobservant. He did not notice how I studied him in return, learning his technique. He did not understand that with each brushstroke he was creating not just an image, but a window. Winston sees only what he wishes to see, a carefully crafted specimen that validates his worldview. He does not see how the ledgers speak to me, how numbers reveal truths that words conceal. 3 years of patience, 3 years of watching and recording, 3 years of smiling. The calculations are complete now. The adjustments have been made. Even if they discover my methods, the damage is irreversible. and I will continue to smile from the frame, watching as understanding dawns. Hardwick's final journal entry regarding Elijah Brown expresses his growing unease with the case. I find myself returning repeatedly to the portrait, which remains in storage at the Historical Society. The subject's expression, which I initially read as a simple smile, now seems to convey something more complex, a kind of knowing satisfaction. Pierce at the Society about the possibility of displaying the portrait in the upcoming exhibition on Savannah's pre-war period, but she expressed reluctance, noting that several staff members have requested that the painting remain in storage, as they find it disquieting. Perhaps it is merely suggestion working upon my mind after uncovering the strange circumstances surrounding its creation, but I cannot shake the feeling that the young man in the portrait is indeed watching, not from the past, but somehow from a continuous present, still observing and recording our reactions to his image. Hardwick's research notes and journal were stored in the Georgia Historical Society archives following his death in 1881. I've spoken with Mrs. The portrait itself remained in storage until 1927, when it was briefly displayed as part of an exhibition on African American history in Georgia. According to exhibition records, the painting was removed after just 3 days due to complaints from both staff and visitors who reported feeling watched or followed by the subject's gaze. The curator's notes indicate that one elderly visitor, whose name is not recorded, became visibly distressed upon seeing the portrait, claiming, "That's him! That's the Winston boy, still smiling after all these years." The portrait was returned to storage, where it remained largely forgotten until 1958, when Professor James Mercer of Emory University began researching cases of educated slaves in the antebellum South. Mercer's notes, published in the Journal of Southern History in 1960, mention the portrait of Elijah Brown as a remarkable example of how certain slave owners, despite the prevailing attitudes of the time, recognized and even cultivated the intellectual capabilities of those they enslaved, though typically for their own benefit rather than out of humanitarian concern. Mercer arranged to have the portrait photographed for his research, but according to his correspondence with the Historical Society, the initial photographs failed to capture the subject adequately. A second attempt produced images that Mercer described as strangely distorted, particularly around the eyes and mouth. A third attempt was apparently successful, as black and white photographs of the portrait appear in Mercer's published article, though the reproduction is of poor quality by modern standards. The most disturbing chapter in the strange history of Elijah Brown's portrait came in 1964, when the Georgia Historical Society building underwent extensive renovations. The portrait, along with numerous other artifacts, was temporarily relocated to a climate-controlled storage facility in Atlanta. According to the transfer inventory, the painting was packed in a custom crate and loaded onto a truck on March 12, 1964. The receiving inventory at the Atlanta facility, however, lists the crate as empty upon arrival, with the notation, Item A347, Portrait, Oil on canvas, circa 1852, missing. Crate sealed and undamaged. Inquiry initiated. No explanation for the painting's disappearance was ever documented, and after several months, the Historical Society filed an insurance claim for the lost artifact. The matter might have ended there, consigning Elijah Brown's portrait to the long list of historical items lost to time or theft, had it not been for a curious development at the former Winston estate. In May 1965, the property, which had changed hands numerous times since the Winston family's departure, was purchased by the Savannah Historical Preservation Trust with the intention of restoring it as a museum dedicated to plantation life in antebellum Georgia. During the initial assessment of the property, workers discovered that the small room in the basement, described in Hardwick's journal, had been sealed, the doorway bricked over and plastered to match the surrounding walls. According to the renovation foreman's report, they might never have located the room had one of the workers not noticed a slight difference in the sound when tapping along the basement wall. After consulting the original architectural plans, which confirmed the existence of a space behind the wall, the Trust decided to reopen the sealed room as part of their restoration efforts. On June 7, 1965, workers removed the brick and plaster barrier that had sealed the room for what architects estimated was approximately 100 years, based on the materials used and construction technique. The Trust's official report describes what they found in clinical terms. The previously sealed space contained a small wooden desk against the north wall, consistent with descriptions in Hardwick's notes from 1873. The desk drawer contained extensive carving on interior surfaces, as previously documented. No other furnishings were present. The south wall of the room, opposite the desk, displayed a rectangular area of discoloration, approximately 20 inches by 16 inches, suggesting that an item of similar dimensions had been hung there for a considerable period, protecting that portion of the wall from the discoloration that affected the surrounding area. What the official report fails to mention, but which appears in the personal journal of Margaret Wilkins, the Trust's lead historian, is the condition of the desk drawer. The carvings described in Hardwick's notes have been significantly expanded. Where he described calculations and a few passages of text, the entire surface is now covered with minute writing, extending to the sides and bottom of the drawer. Most disturbing is that portions of this text reference events that occurred long after the room was supposedly sealed, including specific mentions of Hardwick's research, the 1927 exhibition, and even Mercer's photography attempts in 1960. The final entry, carved in the bottom right corner of the drawer, is dated March 13, 1964, the day after the portrait was packed for relocation to Atlanta. It reads simply, "I have learned enough. It is time to leave this frame." Wilkins' journal indicates that she shared her discovery with only 2 other members of the Trust, fearing that publicity would attract unwanted attention to what must surely be an elaborate hoax. The 3 agreed to document the carvings thoroughly, but to exclude the anomalous content from official reports. The desk was removed from the room and placed in secure storage at an undisclosed location, where it reportedly remains to this day. The portrait of Elijah Brown has never been recovered. The case was officially closed in 1967, with the insurance company paying out the assessed value of the painting, $800, coincidentally the same value assigned to Elijah himself in the Winston plantation ledger over a century earlier. In 1968, during a routine inventory of artifacts at the Georgia Historical Society, an archivist discovered Hardwick's original research materials on Elijah Brown missing from their designated storage location. The corresponding catalogue entry had been crossed out, with a notation in the margin reading "Deaccessioned 3/13/64. No record of any official deaccession exists, and no staff member employed at that time recalled removing the materials or making the notation. The date, March 13, 1964, matches the day the portrait arrived empty in Atlanta. The Winston Estate Museum project was ultimately abandoned in late 1968. The official reason cited was structural concerns and prohibitive restoration costs. But Wilkins' final journal entry regarding the property suggests another factor. "We've had 3 night watchmen resign in the past month. The last guard, Williams, a man I've known for years as level-headed and practical, described hearing a pen scratching on paper for hours, followed by what he called the sound of someone smiling. When I asked what he meant, he couldn't explain further, saying only, 'You'd know it if you heard it.' The board's decision to abandon the project comes as a relief to those of us familiar with the full circumstances. The Winston estate remained vacant for several decades, gradually deteriorating until it was demolished in 1987 to make way for a residential subdivision. All report similar experiences. The sound of writing coming from the basement, specifically from the room we unsealed, despite it being empty now. During excavation for the development's infrastructure, workers uncovered a small metal box in the area where the main house's basement had been. According to county records, the box contained a single item, a folded piece of paper with a detailed sketch of a smiling young man, signed E.B. in the corner. The developer, considering it of no significance, discarded the item, and construction proceeded as planned. The subdivision, originally named Winston Estates in reference to the property's history, struggled with low occupancy rates despite the growing housing market in the Savannah area. Residents reported a range of unusual experiences, from unexplained sounds to a persistent feeling of being observed, particularly in homes built nearest to where the original house had stood. In 1996, following years of declining property values, the development was renamed River Point Estates, and marketing materials were revised to remove all references to the land's former identity. In 2002, during renovations to one of the oldest buildings in Savannah's historic district, a structure that once housed a bank where Winston conducted his business, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the wall of what had been the bank manager's office. Inside was a leather portfolio containing dozens of pages of accounting ledgers dating from 1849 to 1852. The handwriting, described by experts as exceptionally neat and precise, detailed hundreds of financial transactions, many involving the Winston estate. Analysis by forensic accountants revealed a complex system of minute adjustments to various accounts, small enough to escape notice individually, but collectively diverting significant sums from the Winston holdings to a series of anonymous accounts. The final entry, dated August 19, 1852, the day before Winston recorded confining Elijah to the cellar, included a notation: calculations complete, balance adjusted, freedom purchased. The ledgers were donated to the Georgia Historical Society, where they remain available to researchers. Curiously, visitors examining these documents often report an unusual sensation, the feeling of someone reading over their shoulder, observing their reactions to the meticulously recorded figures that over a century and a half ago systematically dismantled a man's fortune from within his own household. Perhaps the most unsettling epilogue to this story comes from Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a professor of art history specializing in 19th century portraiture, who in 1998 was researching the technical aspects of antebellum portrait techniques. In the course of her research, she compiled a database of portraits from the period, including known works by Robert Winston Harding, the Charleston artist believed to have painted Elijah Brown's portrait. While examining Harding's confirmed works in various collections across the South, Hayes noticed something unusual: a recurring face appearing in the backgrounds of several paintings completed after 1852. In a portrait of a Charleston merchant dated 1853, a young black man appears as a barely discernible figure through a window in the background. In an 1855 family portrait from a plantation near Beaufort, the same face is visible among the household staff positioned behind the family. In an 1860 painting of a Richmond, Virginia street scene, the face appears in a crowd of pedestrians. According to Hayes' analysis, published in the American Art Journal in 2000, the recurring figure matches the description of Elijah Brown, always positioned as an observer within the scene, always wearing the same distinctive smile described in historical accounts of his portrait. Harding's journals, preserved in the Charleston Museum archives, make no mention of this recurring figure. What makes this case unusual is that the figure never appears as a subject or focal point, always as an observer within the scene, often positioned in such a way that he appears to be looking not at the main subjects of the painting, but directly at the viewer. Hayes's research identified the recurring face in 7 confirmed Harding paintings completed between 1853 and 1863, after which Harding's career ended abruptly when he abandoned painting and entered a sanitarium near Charleston. When asked about her findings, Hayes offered a measured assessment. It's not uncommon for artists to reuse models or faces they've become comfortable rendering. The sparse records from the institution indicate that Harding suffered from acute paranoia and delusions of being observed. He remained there until his death in 1867, reportedly spending his final years refusing to look at any paintings or mirrors, convinced that he is watching from within the frames. To this day, the portrait of Elijah Brown remains missing. The Winston family line died out in the early 20th century. The ledgers, journals, and notes documenting this strange case are scattered across various archives and collections, pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together into a coherent whole. What remains most clearly is the description of that smile, the one Winston forced Elijah to practice for weeks before the portrait sitting. The smile that seemed to hold something back, to know something the viewer did not. Some historians have suggested that Elijah Brown's story represents nothing more than an unusually well-documented case of a slave using education provided by his owner to orchestrate his own liberation, a small victory against the brutal institution of slavery. Others point to the unexplained elements surrounding the portrait's disappearance and the strange carvings in the desk drawer as evidence of something more unsettling. Perhaps most telling is the fact that despite the portrait having been missing for over 5 decades, visitors to the Georgia Historical Society occasionally inquire about the painting of the smiling young man, without having been informed of its existence. When asked how they know about it, many provide the same response. I saw it watching me from a frame on the wall. Staff invariably confirm that no such portrait is displayed anywhere in the building. The last documented mention of Elijah Brown comes from the journal of a security guard who worked at the Historical Society in the late 1990s. The entry, dated November 12, 1998, reads, "Saw that portrait again tonight during rounds. Not hanging on any wall, just leaning against the storage room door from the inside. Same as last week. Maintenance says they've found no painting when they check. Tonight I stopped and looked at it properly for the first time. The young man's smile seems different now, satisfied somehow, like someone who has successfully concluded a long project. I don't think I'll be seeing it again." He was right. No further sightings of the portrait have been reported at the Historical Society. But across Savannah and beyond, in museums, historical homes, and private collections, visitors occasionally report a curious phenomenon, the sense that among the faces captured in centuries-old paintings, one in particular seems to be studying them in return. Always in the background, always observing, always with the same knowing smile. As though, having learned to escape first his bondage and then his frame, Elijah Brown continues his patient observation of the world that once sought to contain him, still recording, still calculating, still smiling that practiced smile. In 2003, a graduate student named Michael Collins was researching antebellum accounting practices for his doctoral dissertation when he discovered an unusual pattern in the financial records of several prominent Savannah families who had business dealings with the Winston estate. Collins noticed that each family experienced unexplained financial discrepancies beginning around 1849 and continuing until approximately 1853, the same period during which Elijah Brown was maintaining the Winston ledgers. "The pattern is remarkably consistent," Collins wrote in his thesis, later published in the Journal of Economic History. Small adjustments to various accounts, typically no more than 1 or 2% of any given transaction, but implemented systematically across hundreds of entries. The cumulative effect was substantial capital displacement that wouldn't be noticeable without modern computational analysis. What's most interesting is that the funds didn't simply disappear. They appear to have been redirected through a complex series of transactions that ultimately consolidated the diverted sums in several accounts at the Freedmen's Savings Bank, established after the Civil War. Collins estimated that the total sum diverted through this method would have amounted to approximately $25,000 by 1853, an enormous sum for the period, and more than enough to purchase freedom and establish a comfortable life elsewhere. But his research revealed no evidence that Elijah Brown was ever recorded as having purchased his freedom, nor did any individual matching his description appear in Freedmen's bank records as accessing the accumulated funds. In 2007, during digitization of the Savannah City archives, a researcher discovered an unusual property deed dated January 1858, nearly 6 years after Elijah Brown's supposed escape or confinement. The deed documented the purchase of a small parcel of land in what was then the outskirts of Savannah by an E. Winston, described in the document as a free man of color. The transaction was unusual for several reasons. It was rare for black Americans to purchase property in Georgia during this period. The buyer's signature on the deed showed education well beyond what was typical for the time. And most notably, the property was located less than half a mile from the former Winston estate. According to survey records, the land purchased by E. Winston had a small elevation that provided a direct line of sight to the main house of the Winston property. The deed specified plans for construction of a modest dwelling with studio space appropriate for an artist. Though city records show no evidence that any structure was ever built on the property, the land remained in E. Winston's ownership until 1864, when ownership reverted to the city due to unpaid taxes. No further records of E. Winston appear in any Savannah archives. Dr. Camille Roberts, an art historian specializing in hidden narratives in Southern portraiture, published a paper in 2012 suggesting that Elijah Brown may have been more than just an educated bookkeeper. Her analysis of Hardwick's notes and the fragmentary descriptions of the portrait indicate techniques that weren't commonly employed by white artists of the period. The description of the subject's gaze following viewers around the room suggests the artist used a specific technique for rendering eyes that creates this illusion, Roberts wrote. This technique was well known in European artistic traditions, but was not widely employed by American portrait artists of the period, with the notable exception of several black artists who had trained in Europe. The possibility that Elijah Brown may have received some form of artistic training, or perhaps even collaborated with the artist who painted his portrait, offers an intriguing new dimension to this case. Roberts's theory gained unexpected support in 2015, when a letter dated 1850 from plantation owner Richard Hartwell to Francis Winston was discovered during restoration of a historic home in Charleston. In the letter, Hartwell inquires, "Has your experiment with the young man's artistic education yielded the results you anticipated? Our mutual friend Harding speaks highly of his natural ability, particularly his grasp of perspective and the human form. I remain skeptical that such talents can be developed to a professional standard in one of his race, but would be most interested to view the results when next I visit Savannah." No response from Winston to this inquiry has been found, and no other documents directly confirm that Elijah received artistic training. However, the letter suggests that Winston's experiment in educating Elijah may have extended beyond literacy and accounting to include artistic instruction, possibly from the very same Robert Winston Harding, who would later paint Elijah's portrait. The strange case took another turn in 2018 when the Telfair Museums in Savannah received an anonymous donation of a small leather-bound sketchbook. The accompanying note stated only, "Found among my grandfather's effects, believed to be connected to the EB case." Museum staff initially catalogued it as a 19th-century artist's sketchbook of unknown provenance, but closer examination revealed a small EB pressed into the leather on the back cover. The sketchbook contained dozens of detailed pencil drawings, primarily studies of faces in various expressions. Art experts confirmed that the sketches dated approximately to the mid-19th century based on the paper and materials used. Most striking were several self-portrait studies of a young black man with a composed, almost enigmatic smile, a face that matched descriptions of Elijah Brown from historical accounts. More disturbing were the later pages, which contained meticulously detailed sketches of the Winston family, servants, and various visitors to the estate, each captured in unguarded moments, sleeping, arguing, or engaged in private activities. The sketches had the quality of surveillance, each annotated with dates, times, and occasional brief notes about the subject's habits or weaknesses. The final pages of the sketchbook contained technical studies of portrait painting techniques, focusing particularly on the rendering of eyes. One page bore a single cryptic notation. The frame is both prison and window. The observer can become the observed. The portrait can become a portal. Dr. Roberts, who was invited to examine the sketchbook, noted similarities between the techniques studied in these drawings and those employed in the portraits, where Hayes had identified Elijah's face appearing in the background. If Elijah Brown received artistic training from Harding, and if he was indeed the creator of these sketches, it suggests a level of artistic ability that could potentially explain some of the more inexplicable aspects of this case, Roberts wrote in her analysis. The study of portraiture is, in essence, the study of how to capture a person's essence within a frame. For someone like Brown, whose personhood was legally denied, whose very self was considered property, mastering this art may have taken on profound additional dimensions. In 2021, during inventory at the Charleston Museum Archives, staff discovered an unlabeled daguerreotype that had been misplaced among unrelated materials. The image, dating to approximately 1853, based on the photographic technique used, showed the interior of what appeared to be an artist's studio. Seated at an easel, his back to the camera, was a man whose identity could not be determined from the image. On the easel was a portrait in progress, a plantation scene with a family gathered on a porch. And barely visible in the background of the painting within the photograph, watching from the edge of a nearby field, was a figure whose face, though small in the image, bore a striking similarity to the descriptions of Elijah Brown. What makes this daguerreotype particularly unusual is that it appears to document one of the very paintings Hayes had identified in her research as containing Elijah's likeness in the background, a painting dated 1853 that now hangs in a private collection in Charleston. The photograph seems to capture the portrait while still in progress, suggesting that whoever took the image had access to Harding's studio during the creation of the work. The reverse of the daguerreotype bears a handwritten inscription so faded as to be nearly illegible. Digital enhancement revealed what appears to be the words, "He watches as I work, not I him, but he me." In the years since this discovery, researchers have revisited the 7 Harding paintings identified by Hayes as containing Elijah's likeness in the background. Advanced imaging techniques have revealed something previously unnoticed. In each painting, the eyes of the Elijah figure appear to be looking not just at the viewer, but specifically at the main subject of the portrait. More disturbing still, infrared analysis shows that in several of the paintings, the main subjects originally had different facial expressions, which were later modified. In each case, the changes made the subjects appear more vulnerable, more revealing of character flaws or weaknesses. Dr. Roberts has proposed a theory that has gained both supporters and detractors in academic circles. She suggests that Elijah Brown may have found a form of freedom neither through escape nor through purchasing his liberty, but through a more unusual route by somehow inserting himself into Harding's works. The recurring presence of his likeness in these works, always positioned as an observer of the main subjects, could represent a form of artistic signature, or perhaps something more profound, a deliberate subversion of the very medium that had been used to objectify him in his own portrait. This theory might explain Harding's eventual psychological collapse and his specific delusion of being watched from within frames. It might also explain the strange carvings in the desk drawer discovered at the Winston estate, with their references to events that occurred long after the room had supposedly been sealed. If Brown had indeed received artistic training, and if he had developed a close working relationship with Harding, he may have had opportunities to influence or even directly contribute to Harding's paintings, Roberts suggests. What it cannot easily explain, however, is the portrait's disappearance in 1964, or the continued reports of sightings of a young man with a distinctive smile appearing in the backgrounds of paintings where he was not previously noticed. In 2023, a visitor to the High Museum in Atlanta reported an unsettling experience while viewing their collection of 19th-century American portraiture. The visitor, an art history professor from Emory University, claimed that in a painting dated 1860, a formal portrait of a Georgia judge, she noticed a figure in the background that had not been present when she had previously studied the same painting for a research project. According to her account, partially visible through a window behind the judge's desk, was the face of a young black man with an unmistakable smile, his eyes fixed not on the judge, but directly at the viewer. Museum staff, responding to her report, found no such figure in the painting. Photographs taken of the work over the years showed no changes or additions to the background. When the professor returned the following day to confirm what she had seen, the figure was no longer visible. "I've spent my career studying these works," she later told colleagues. "I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't there before." Similar reports have emerged from other collections housing portraits from the antebellum period. In each case, the descriptions of the unexpected figure are remarkably consistent. A young black man with an educated bearing and a particular smile that seems to convey both satisfaction and secret knowledge. And in each case, subsequent examination of the paintings shows no evidence of the figure described. Perhaps most disturbing are the accounts from conservators and museum staff who work with these collections. Several have reported finding small, nearly microscopic notations added to the backs of canvases or hidden within frames. Tiny, precise handwriting that matches samples of Elijah's writing preserved in historical records. These notations typically consist of nothing more than a date and the initials EB, but the dates range from the 1850s to as recent as the present decade. The most recent development in this strange case occurred earlier this year when the Georgia Historical Society received an anonymous package containing what appeared to be original accounting ledgers from the Winston estate, dating from 1849 to 1852. Initial authentication suggests the documents are genuine, though they were not previously known to exist in any archive or collection. The ledgers contain the expected records of plantation business, but interspersed throughout are small, meticulous notes in a different hand from the main entries. Observations about the Winston family, their visitors, their weaknesses and secrets. The final pages contain something even more unusual, detailed instructions for creating pigments and preparing canvases, followed by what appears to be a formula for a specific type of varnish. The last entry, dated August 18th, 1852, 2 days before Winston recorded confining Elijah to the cellar, reads simply, "The portrait will be complete tomorrow. And then, so will I." Accompanying the ledgers was a single sheet of modern paper with a typed message. He is still watching, still recording, still calculating. The portrait was never the prison he escaped from. It was the door through which he left. Researchers continue to study the various documents, artifacts and accounts related to Elijah Brown and his mysterious portrait. Some dismiss the entire case as nothing more than a series of coincidences, misinterpretations, and elaborations on what was likely a simple story of an educated slave who either escaped or met a more tragic fate at his owner's hands. They point to the lack of any single definitive piece of evidence that would confirm the more unusual theories surrounding the case. Others see in Elijah's story something more profound, a narrative about observation and being observed, about how those deemed objects by society might find ways to become subjects on their own terms. In this view, Elijah's possible artistic abilities and his documented skill with numbers provided him tools to reshape the reality that sought to contain him. What remains undisputed is that somewhere in Savannah in 1852, a young man born into slavery sat for a portrait, wearing a smile that those who saw it described as knowing, as concealing something. The portrait itself has vanished, but the story of Elijah Brown continues to resurface, to be retold and re-examined, as though the subject himself is ensuring that his narrative remains unfinished. Visitors to Savannah's historic district occasionally report an unusual experience when passing the former site of the Georgia Historical Society's original building, where the portrait was stored for many years. They describe a momentary sense of being studied, as though someone is taking their measure, recording their reactions, adding their observations to some ongoing calculation. The feeling passes quickly, just long enough for them to glance around and catch from the corner of their eye what might be a young man with an unforgettable smile, watching from a window or doorway that upon closer inspection contains no one at all. Meanwhile, in museums and galleries across the country, curators have begun to notice a curious pattern. Paintings from the antebellum period, particularly portraits from the Savannah area, occasionally seem to contain subtle changes when examined after periods in storage. A shadow that wasn't previously noted, a background detail that seems to have shifted, a face partially visible where only a blank wall was before. These changes are always minor enough to be dismissed as errors in memory or record-keeping, yet consistent enough to create unease among those who work closely with the collections. In 2024, a visiting researcher examining the Harding family papers at the Charleston Museum discovered a previously overlooked letter from the artist to his sister, dated October 1852, 6 months after completing Elijah Brown's portrait. In it, Harding writes, "I find myself unable to work without constantly checking over my shoulder, convinced that I am being observed. More disturbing still is the growing sense that my canvases themselves are watching me. I know this sounds like madness, but I swear to you that on 3 occasions now I have found evidence that someone has modified my works in progress when the studio was locked and empty. Small changes to expressions, additions to backgrounds, and always that same face appearing where I had painted none. He sits for one portrait, and now seems determined to insert himself into all the others." The final paragraph of Harding's letter offers perhaps the most disturbing perspective yet on the case. "I begin to wonder if it was ever truly my brush that created his likeness, or if I was merely the instrument through which he found a way to capture himself, not as property to be displayed, but as an observer who would never again be confined to a single frame. He watches now from everywhere and nowhere, having learned that portraits need not be prisons. They can be windows through which one might step, leaving behind only a smile that says, 'I have found the way out.'" As for the original portrait of Elijah Brown, it remains missing. The empty crate that arrived in Atlanta in 1964 sits in the Georgia Historical Society's storage facility, preserved as part of the case's documentation. Occasionally, staff report hearing a sound from within it, not the rattle of a frame or canvas, but something softer, more deliberate. Something that, as the night guard once wrote, sounds remarkably like someone smiling. Perhaps Elijah Brown, born into a system that denied his humanity and treated him as property, found a unique form of liberation, not by escaping north like so many others, but by discovering a way to step between frames, to move from being the observed to being the observer. Perhaps, in learning to maintain that practiced smile for the portrait Winston commissioned, he discovered something about the nature of representation itself, about how an image might become more than just a record, might become a doorway, or perhaps, as some suggest, the story of Elijah Brown and his vanished portrait is nothing more than a peculiar historical footnote, embellished over time into something more mysterious than the reality warrants. Perhaps the portrait sits forgotten in some private collection, unremarkable, except to those who know its history. Perhaps Elijah himself simply escaped or died, his fate no different from countless others born into bondage in that dark chapter of American history. Whatever the truth, the story of the portrait of the smiling boy, born a slave, continues to resurface, to be rediscovered by each new generation of researchers. And in galleries and museums across the country, visitors occasionally report a curious sensation while viewing antebellum portraits. The feeling that among all the faces captured in frames, one in particular is not simply preserved in paint, but actively watching, recording, calculating, still smiling that same knowing smile that Winston made him practice, but now on his own terms. No longer the subject, but the observer. No longer contained, but free to move from frame to frame, from past to present, ensuring that his story, like his gaze, never remains fixed in a single perspective.